About a year ago, I moved my family and I to a home way out in the woods in Tennessee. I wanted to be brief here, but I need to get this off my chest. And after looking into this a little bit more, I have a lot more details that I think will paint a clearer picture in the end, so just bear with me. The nights here can be very loud. Between the crickets, the tree frogs, and everything else in between, it can be deafening. One night, not too long after we moved in, I had forgotten something in my car and headed outside to go get it. The first thing that struck me as odd was that my dog wouldn't go outside with me. My dog goes everywhere with me. But not this night. As I held the door open, she looked out then looked up at me like no. So I walked out and shut the door behind me. The second thing that caught me off guard was that there was not a peep. It was dead silent. I still shrugged this off and walked down my front steps and headed down to my car. When I had gotten about 10 feet from my car, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I felt as though something was watching me. I looked around but saw nothing. After I reached into my vehicle for what I had forgotten to grab earlier, I had this feeling like something was moving towards me. I took a step back and I checked around me. All of a sudden, I heard one of my hedges next to me that lined the walkway to our front door rattle. At first, I thought it was a rabbit that I had scared, as I had seen one just earlier in the day right where this was. A few seconds later, I heard the sound of a large rock landing a few feet away from me. It hit the walkway and bounced into a shrub. I drew my gun and called out and said whoever this was is about to get shot. After a few seconds of nothing, I began to think that maybe this was some local teenager messing with the new people. I holstered my gun and turned and started walking back to the front door. Almost as soon as I turned towards my house, I heard this deep sound. It sounded like a huge dog, but what made me know back to my front door was that it sounded like it was right behind me. I leaped up into my porch, turned and drew my firearm again, expecting something right there. But again, there was nothing. A couple weeks later, I was on my porch at night, sitting on a bench with my wife. She got up and walked inside to get something, and as soon as she shut the door, I heard that same sound again. I couldn't see anything, yet this sounded like it was right on top of me. The sound was coming from everywhere, and it was very loud. Again, I couldn't see anything, so I noped it back inside of my house. Now at this point I was questioning moving here, but after nothing else really happening, I let it all go. A month or so later, it was a really rainy and stormy night. This is around 9 p.m., and my wife and I enjoy listening to the rain and talking about how relaxing the rain is. I grew up in Oregon, so I love the rain. And for the past 10 years, we lived somewhere else where it would dump the entire year of rain in one single day, then be bone dry for the rest of the year. Now for my wife, the rain was such a rare thing. She loved going outside and watching the rain. So for us, this is an enjoyable experience. As we were sitting there talking about the rain and relaxing, my wife stops and says, "Did you hear that?" And I said, no. What did you hear?" "I swear it sounded like a small child calling for help out in the woods beside our house," she said. "No, I didn't hear anything." After a few moments of us listening, she was like, "There it is. I didn't hear anything, sweetie. Are you sure you're not just hearing things?" She looked at me offended that I didn't hear anything and said, "No, I'm positive. How could you not hear that? It was our son. I think he's out there and got lost." We then both looked through the blinds that were open right behind us, and we could see all of our children laying there. She said it was so weird that it sounded like our son. Well, it's not him. He's right there. Besides, I don't hear anything. She then stands up and says, "Wow, he's really crying out for help. I need to go look for him." Now at this point, if you knew my wife, you would know that she is absolutely creeped out by the woods and wouldn't be caught dead walking into them during daylight, much less at night during a storm. I grabbed her hand and said, "I've been listening, and there's nobody calling out for help." At this point, I'm getting a little bit worried. She was acting completely out of character, not to mention that at this time she is 8 months pregnant with our baby daughter. She then says, What if there's some child out there lost? Well, first of all, I would be able to hear them as well. Second, there are no other kids around here for miles, and the odds of them being lost 100 feet from our house is not possible. She then says, I know, but what if it's a kid? Before I could say anything else, she stands up and starts walking towards the stairs. I jumped up and grabbed her hand again and said, I don't know what's going on, but you need to go inside. I didn't know what this was, but it freaked me out. A few months after this, just as it was getting dark outside, I heard the front door to our house open and I got up to investigate. We have autistic 6-year-old twins, and we have the door set up so that they can't open it without us there. So to hear the sound, it could only be my wife. What was more weird is the fact that she doesn't go outside without saying something to me. I walked out front and saw my wife walking down our private road towards the drive on the side of our house. I asked her what she's doing, and she said that she was sitting on the back patio and kept hearing a baby crying out in the woods. Are you serious? And you just decided to walk off into the woods to investigate? I said. She then looks out into the woods and says, See, there it is again. I couldn't hear anything, but what I did notice is that it was completely quiet outside again. I told her just like before, the chances of a baby being out in the woods outside our house is slim, and that she needed to get back in the house. She then said, what if someone left a baby out there? Well, if that was true, I would hear it as well. Now at this point I was really starting to worry about my wife's mental health. I asked her to see a psychiatrist, and she did. Looking back now, I feel really bad about this, knowing what I know now. A key to this moment was that my wife had just given birth to a baby girl a month before. A few days after this, we're out on the front porch again. It's early evening, and I had just cut the grass this day, and our 3-year-old son was riding around on his little car in front of the house. Now he knows that he's not allowed outside of a certain area that we mapped off. He loves playing outside, but with the road behind 50 feet from our front porch, we have to be careful as a lot of trucks will fly through after drinking all day on their boats. As we're talking, we're both keeping an eye on him. A neighbor then drives by and stops to say hi for a second. This interaction took about 8 seconds, as all they said was how are things, and we said we're good, and he told us he would stop by later as his wife got something for the kids, who happens to be one of their teachers in school. We simply say okay, and he drives off. I looked over where our son was at, and he was gone. I called out his name and ran over to the side of the house, and I could hear his car on our side drive. I scolded him for leaving the area, and he said something in his 3-year-old gibberish and pointed to the woods behind our house. I then told him that he had 5 seconds to get back up to the front of the house or else. He then pointed back in the direction of the woods and kept trying to tell me something. I looked off to where he was pointing at, and just assumed that he saw a deer or a squirrel or something and he wanted to see it up close. I walked him back up to the front of the house and he cried the whole way there. He got really upset that I wouldn't let him go into the woods, but I just wrote this off as him being curious, as most 3-year-old boys are. Now this situation isn't isolated, as our twins have done similar things, but nothing very extreme like this. There have been nights where we just laid down for the night, and we heard a loud bang on the side of our house on the wall behind our bed. It was so loud that I jumped up and looked out the window. Our floodlight had come on, but I couldn't see anything. Now the weird part about this is that our bedroom sits about 12 feet from the ground level, as we have a full-size basement that's cinder block. I put on my slippers and grabbed my shotgun and walked outside to investigate. It was dead silent again. The floodlight that's on the side of the house had clicked off at this point, so I walked over to the end of the deck and shined my light around the yard. There was nothing. I walked around the house and shined the light around intently. As I approached the back side of my house, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Again, it felt like someone was watching me. I shined the light up in the trees, but again, nothing. I rounded the corner and the first thing I noticed was that my 3 dogs that were in their area weren't making a single sound. Now our dogs have no filter and will bark at anyone, and everyone. This includes me as well. So to see them all hiding with their tails between their legs, not making a single sound, really had me worried. As I kept walking, all of a sudden, the crickets and frogs started making sounds again. It was like someone had clicked a switch. I walked back into the house and told my wife that I hadn't seen anything. She shrugged and said okay as long as our dogs were okay. Due to the circumstances that night, I decided to let the dogs in and sleep with us. This very same thing has happened on all 4 exterior walls of our house. It's random and annoying, but just like this instance, every time there's nothing going on outside. There have also been times when we're sitting in the house, and as I was watching a movie, my wife walked over to me and said, "Did you call me?" I say no, and she says that she heard me call her name in her ear. She said it was definitely my voice, but she didn't understand because it sounded so close, and I was a good 20 feet away from her in my recliner. The important part to this was that she was sitting at the table doing something, and the slider to the backyard was open behind her. Now, our back patio sits about 20 feet off the ground, and it's like a balcony as it has no stair access outside. There have been several instances where she would say that she heard someone whisper in her ear, but she couldn't make out the sound. Again, I kept thinking that she was going crazy, but as you will see, I think all of this is tied into this final moment where things are revealed. The last thing I want to mention before we get into what just happened is that I have a shooting range built behind my workshop on the opposite side of our property next to the main road. It's kind of on a downslope, but it works perfectly for what I need it for. The range itself is cut straight into the woods going down about 100 yards or so. When you're at the downrange, you have woods surrounding you on all sides except back up to my shop. I have to say, it has always felt creepy when I'm dealing with my targets or mowing the grass. When you're down there, it feels like you're miles from anyone. One day, around 5 in the evening, I was sighting in a new rifle scope. The sun was still up, but it was going to start to fade soon, so I knew this was going to be the final test. Up until this point, nothing really happened while I was making my trips downrange, other than the feeling of uneasiness. As I got downrange, I kept getting this feeling like someone, or something, was watching me. I looked around but didn't see anything. As I was placing stickers over my previous shots, I heard something big off to the side of me. It sounded like a large branch had snapped off of a tree. Now, if you've been in the Tennessee woods, you will know that a lot of branches fall off the trees randomly out of nowhere. Except this time, it was very loud and sounded like fresh, strong wood, if that makes any sense. I turned and looked, but again I couldn't see anything. I started walking back up to my rifle, and I swear, I heard someone right behind me. I turned around, but again, saw nothing. As I started to walk again, that's when I heard it, a deep growling noise. It was really deep and loud, and what's worse is that it was all around me. I turned around facing the range and started walking backwards. The thought of some rabid dog charging out of the bushes had me freaked out, so running wasn't a good idea. I slowly walked backwards up the hill to my rifle, but nothing happened. I grabbed my rifle and sprayed the target with rapid fire, hoping to scare off whatever was stalking me. I left 10 rounds in the mag, then grabbed my rifle bag, and I quickly walked back up to the house. I never told my wife about this, as I didn't want to freak her out. So about a year later from when we moved in, my niece started staying with us as a live-in nanny to earn money over summer break from college. We were on our way back from the store, and about a mile from our house, I saw 2 eyes reflecting in the headlights coming from a white tree on the side of the road just ahead. It caught my attention because they were higher than a deer, but a different color and size. Just as I had said, "What is that?" and squinted, they had vanished. I had made a comment that it was almost as if they had known I could see its eyes and moved. The color was kind of golden green, but they resembled the mannerism of a large cat, as they felt ominous. It's hard to explain, but I shrugged it off as we were passing the tree and saw nothing. A few moments later, we arrived at the house. As we were getting bags out of the car, My 3-year-old son came running out of the house excited to see me. As I was waiting to help her carry in her bags, I heard my dog growl. I looked in the direction she was looking at, which was towards my neighbor's property across the street. What I saw has kept me up all night. Up until this point, I have always been skeptical, as I had never seen anything with my own 2 eyes. Even with what just happened to me the year prior, I still had my doubts that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. My street is kind of a spread out neighborhood. Each house sits on several acres, and at the end of our road is Kentucky Lake. My neighbor's house is adjacent to my house on about an acre or 2 lot. Directly in front of my house is a wall of woods, and directly behind my house is several thousand acres of untouched forest. As I was looking across the street to my neighbor's property, I saw a large dark figure between the trees at first. The movement caught me off guard, as it looked like something big moving quickly on all 4s. Then, when it came out into clear view, it stood up and walked like a man. At first, I didn't know what to make of it. It was very tall, but the strange thing about it was that the distance it was covering, I swear, I could see through it. It was clearly walking quickly, but moving faster than any person could even sprint. There was also no sound. It was like it was phasing in and out of reality as it moved. I then said, "What the hell is that?" and realized that it was looking directly at us. It had moved at an angle away from us to minimize the time out in the open, and moving quickly as it could while still being silent. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I realized that whatever it was stalking us. I told my niece to get in the house right now, and I grabbed my son and booked it inside. I grabbed my rifle with a short scope and came back outside to see my niece still grabbing stuff out of her car. I watched over her without saying a word. As she was slowly walking, she turned towards the woods across the street from my house, and suddenly bolted for the house. She ran up the steps in a panicked state. I asked her what she saw, and her face was pale as a ghost. She then said, "I heard something big in the woods walking loud on the leaves, and when I turned towards it, I heard a deep guttural growl." I asked her why she didn't come when I told her, and she said she thought I was talking to my son. I told her what I had seen, and she wanted to get a closer look to see if she could see something. As she was walking on the walkway, I heard the sound of dry leaves crunching in the woods across the street. She's about 6 feet away from my wife's SUV. As she turned and started walking back to me, I caught a glimpse of something gray and hairy move from behind the SUV back across the street into the woods. My porch is kinda elevated, and our SUV is about 6 feet tall, and whatever this was, it cleared about 45 feet in what looked to be a single jump. It moved like lightning. Whatever it was, it wanted my niece. It jumped behind the car out of my line of sight and was waiting for her. She still doubted my warnings and grabbed a flashlight and walked back towards the car. As she entered my driveway, she stopped dead in her tracks, leaned a little bit, as if she could see something. I asked her what she saw. That's when she turned and ran back up the porch with a terrified look on her face. She said it was a figure, a shadow, hiding inside of a tree, and that she saw its eyes. I asked her what they looked like, and all she could say was that they looked red at first, but as she got closer, they looked dead. I said, "What do you mean by dead?" And she said that where the pupils were, it looked gray, like the way eyes look when they go blind, and she swears that she could see through it, almost like a dark cloud. She wanted to go out again and took a step down the stairs, and as she did, that's when it revealed itself from the tree. I then said to get inside, and I went in and locked the door. It looked like a very tall human-shaped being. It was really tall, and it looked ominous as hell. The next morning, we did a height comparison to the tree limb where she saw it stand over, and we put it to around 9 feet tall, and its eyes were about 6 inches apart. At this point, I don't know what this thing was. After doing some research, I think this thing was a glimmer man, a crawler. I looked to see if there had been any other sightings in Benson County, but nothing. More important, I swear it would face in and out. almost like a shadow person but bigger and more obvious. One of the weirdest things that I have came up with is that this thing can communicate without saying anything. This might explain why everyone was hearing something that nobody else could hear. Second, it has a playback-like communication. So when I heard a dog panting, it was most likely one of my dogs it heard. My wife was actually hearing our son crying for help, as he had recently fell and cried for help as well. The baby crying would be our newborn baby, who she had given birth to recently, and it must have heard me call my wife's name, and so maybe that's how it was calling my wife's name with my voice. Another thing that my niece had said that night was that she felt compelled to go back outside to it. She said she felt like this thing was communicating with her somehow, and it wanted her to go back outside. The more I read about this, the more everything that's been happening over the past year makes sense. One thing that I find extra convincing is that down the road, towards the lake, there's a property that is barbed wired off, and it's nothing but forest with no driveway. A lot of the property down our road is undeveloped land, and on one of the trees, there is this large old sign that says, "Screamer lives here," with an arrow pointing back into the woods. I have to admit, when I first saw this sign, I laughed thinking maybe the owner screamed at trespassers who enter his property, and teenagers put up the sign to mess with him. But when I did a satellite search of our neighborhood, that entire section of road has no houses or trails or anything, and it's just pure forest. Now that you understand my story, I doubt this is the ending. The next question is, what can we do? I don't want my wife or kids to disappear one day. I feel perplexed and scared, as what can I do? If you have any advice, let me know. Update 1. Thank you all for the support. We're overwhelmed with the number of responses that we have had. Unfortunately, we can't afford to get a camera system or the trail cameras that many have recommended. I'm a disabled veteran and had just lost my business to the COVID lockdowns, and we're struggling a little bit. That being said, I did go out soon after posting at night to try and get some evidence to bring here for you. The camera on my phone is not great for nighttime, and it seems to make the images very grainy with the low light. As I was sitting there that night, I did catch some strange sounds on the camera, as well as when I passed an area with my flashlight, there appeared to be something. But when I came back to it, there was nothing. Again, due to the light, it's very hard to make out. I haven't felt comfortable going out since then. My niece just came back from a week's vacation in Florida, so we're planning to sit out there a couple of nights to see if we can get anything. This stuff has been happening for some time now, but it was random and far apart. Ever since this last incident, I have seen things that I can't even explain, but they seem to be happening almost on a daily basis now. Last night, when my niece arrived, we went out on the front porch to welcome her. I did notice something that looked like a face that was staring at me, but what is weird, as I was staring at it, it moved back into the shadow without moving, if that even makes any sense. These are the things I really want to get on here for you. There is a story of a man in Georgia who I believe saw the exact same thing I did that night, and if I find it, I'll post a link for you as well. We're also going to be working with an artist to try and get a good picture to show exactly what we saw that night. I really want to keep everyone updated on the things going on. There have been many other things that have happened here that I would also like to add. I know that they may not be connected, but I feel like you all should be the judge of that. The one thing that I do want to add in this update that I didn't think was connected was about 2-3 weeks ago. My wife and I had an argument about something silly. She decided to walk back into our woods to clear her mind. I was on the back patio when I noticed her walking down our shooting range. I asked her where she was going, and she said, to cool off. I know the chances of something happening to her was slim, but I did find it strange. that she would choose to go into the woods rather than simply walking down the road. I quickly got dressed and went down to try and bring her back. I went to the end of the range and called out her name. After a few minutes of calling out, I heard nothing. Not a single sound, not a twig, or anything. Now the weird part is that it's impossible to move around these woods without making a sound, especially for her. I was worried that she was walking too far, but I had to get back into the house as our children were alone. It freaked me out because it was as if she had just vanished. I went back in the house and debated calling someone, but I figured I would give her a little more time. I went to the back patio and waited. After about an hour, I started to get really worried. I called out her name again and decided that I would call if she hadn't returned in about 30 minutes. After another 20 minutes went by, she came walking back out of the woods, angry that she had worried me so much, yet also relieved. I asked her what she was thinking, and she said, "What are you talking about?" As she walked back up into the house, she came and looked at me like I was crazy. I said, "Did you not hear me calling out to you?" She said she only heard me once and that she replied. Now, this is where it gets crazy. She said, "I only been gone for about 10 to 15 minutes. Why are you freaking out?" When I told her that she had been gone for an hour and 20 minutes, she didn't believe me. She also said that when she went down there, she didn't go very far, but when she turned around, she started walking and got worried that she was lost. She said she didn't recognize where she was, but something told her to keep walking. She said it felt strange and that the air felt different. When she came back out of the woods, she was relieved to see the house. Now the part that upsets me the most about this was that where she said she was is impossible. I was literally just standing 20 feet away from that spot. If she really was there, not only would I have seen her, but she could have talked to me in a normal voice. More concerning is that you can see the house from this spot, and how she felt lost. It's just crazy. I don't know what this was. I thought that again, that she was just losing her mind. After reading some responses, I feel like what happened to her was real. I do plan to go back to that spot with her to prove that you can see the house from there, but I want her to show me exactly where all she went. I know some people are thinking that we're crazy, but I promise that I'm going to do whatever it takes to get proof and keep you updated as we figure this stuff out. I know it's turning into a book to read, but I want to be detailed as possible. Let me know if you want me to keep posting the updates here like this. I'm going to try to keep a weekly update for you all. Update 2, June 24, 2022. Weird things keep happening. Today, my 3-year-old son is playing on the back patio a few feet away from us, and all of a sudden, the dogs inside jump and start barking as one of our dogs that's on the patio with him comes bolting into the door. I jump up to see what's going on, and my son is pointing at the tree line saying, "Werewolf, Daddy, werewolf." Now my son loves watching videos of werewolves for children for some reason. I would normally put this off as nothing, but if you saw the look in his face, you would know that he was serious. Plus, with the way my dogs reacted, he had to have seen something. I pulled out my phone and began recording. He kept saying, "Daddy, look, werewolf in the bushes." I tell him I can't see anything, but I can hear something really big in the leaves. I'm gonna post a recording of this whole thing to see if any of you all can see anything that I might have missed. Update 3, July 9th, 2022. Alright, I meant to keep everyone updated up until now. I have just had a lot on my plate. My niece has quit. She says she can't handle all the stuff that's been happening to her. Everything was fine for a while. We kept indoors for the most part. We went out on the porch one night with a flashlight and camera hoping to catch something. We kept hearing things in the brush. After a while of not seeing anything, we went back inside. I said my prayers, then slept like a baby. My niece, however, did not. She woke up late the next day and seemed a bit jumpy. I then asked her, "What's wrong?" She said that she didn't sleep well as something was outside her window. It took some time to get her to talk about it. She said she could hear something big outside her window, but every time she looked, she couldn't see anything. She said she heard weird noises that she couldn't describe. She came out in the living room to see if I was still up, but I was fast asleep. She then decided to go back to her room and go to sleep watching YouTube on her phone. She said that she was almost asleep when she felt something standing right behind her. She turned around and said there was nothing. She said she kept having the feeling but brushed it off as her imagination. That was until about 3 a.m. when she woke up. She had the same feeling as before, but this time it was very intense. Like whatever it was, it wanted to devour her. She turned around quickly and saw what looked like a shadow disappear into the wall in the blink of an eye. She told me this kept happening until she passed out late in the morning. I told her it was weird as we have never experienced anything like that in the house before. We have had weird things happen, like things disappear for a while. Then they reappeared days or months later in the exact same spot they last were. She said it felt like whatever this was, it made her feel like it wanted to cause pain. I told her to keep me updated and to let me know if anything else happens. A few days later, she then asked if she can use the hot tub that's out back. I explained that it's off as we can't afford to heat it up. When we get over to it, I open it to look inside. To my disbelief, not only is it on, but the water looks great, minus a little cleanup that needed to be done. As I'm walking around, all of a sudden, I hear this really loud sound behind me, almost like a log falling onto the ground, or a really big boulder hitting the ground. Imagine an engine block falling 20 feet onto soft soil. It made me jump. I turned around but couldn't see anything as the brush was too thick. I kept helping her work on the spa. Then she says that she's gonna go inside and get changed so she can get in. I look around and realize that it's getting dark outside and I really don't want to be out here. I bend over to work on getting the filter cleaned out, and I hear what sounds like something big snapping branches and charging at me. It made me jump and run to the back door. I turned around to see what it was, and it was nothing. I walk back into the house and walk upstairs. I tell her that I heard something out there, and she looked at me for a minute, then said, "Well, I want to get in and relax." She then asked if I can leave the back patio door open so if she needs me, she can call. But according to her, she enjoyed the spa without incident. However, every day I noticed her getting more anxious and less willing to talk about it. She says every night something new happens to her, but when I ask her to explain, she always refuses. A few nights later, I walk out on the porch and notice it's dead quiet again. I ask her to come out on the porch with me, but she says that she's tired and wants to call her boyfriend and go to bed. My wife gets up early and takes care of the kids, and it's my job to handle night shift, so she's in bed at this point. I decide that I don't have the guts to do this alone, so I put on a movie and relax in my recliner. I end up falling asleep, then wake up at around 3 a.m. to a noise coming from my niece's room. It sounds like a very deep voice. I knock on the door. I call out several times, but get nothing in response. I figure it must be her video and decided to let it be. I head to bed, and just as I start to pass out, another loud bang happens. I wake up and hear what sounds like something skittering on the wall outside of my bedroom. I understand that this is way up in the air and physically impossible. I look out the window, but I don't see anything. After going out and checking on this noise a few times over the last year and finding nothing, I decided to forget it and just go back to sleep. The next day, my niece comes out and tells me that she had the shadow thing happen again. Except this time, she left her light on. She said she woke up to getting that feeling again. She said that when she opened her eyes, she could see an extremely tall shadow figure standing over the top of her. She said it was moving closer, and just as she started to see the details of its face, She turned around in a panic, but nothing was there. She said the eyes haunted her but didn't want to elaborate any further. The next morning, for the first time ever, my niece is up bright and early. I noticed that she looked anxious as she told me that she is headed home for the 4th of July weekend and will be back on Tuesday. I ask her if she is okay, and she just says yes and quickly walks out the door. Later that day, I get a call from my sister telling me that she won't be coming back. I ask her if everything is alright, and she says that she just wants to enjoy the rest of her summer. A little while later, I get a call from my niece telling me that she doesn't want to work here anymore, and she can't handle the emotions of whatever is out there. She doesn't explain more than that. I checked on her room, and I noticed that she's been sleeping with one of the windows wide open. This window is perfectly accessible from the outside. I don't know what's been going on with her, but whatever it is, it looks like it could have been coming in the room. Anyways, jumping to the 4th of July, I do fireworks in front of our property by the road facing the woods. Due to what's been happening at night, I decide to do all this prior to it getting dark outside. We do our fireworks, and just as it starts to get dark, I get everyone inside. After a couple of hours, I remember that my hose is still on the ground and laying out by the road. I head out to clean everything up, and I put the hose away. While I'm doing this, that's when I noticed that it's dead silent again, minus the sound of fireworks in the distance. The hairs on the back of my neck go up, and I get the feeling that I'm being watched again. I hurry and fix the hose and ran back to the house. I swear, I'm starting to wonder if it's just my mind playing tricks on me at this point. Update 4, January 2024. We're still here, and most of it has stopped. I have learned after an exhausting amount of research that yes, these things are very real, but they're not what most of us think they are. They're not our friends, and will never be. They have a hatred towards us, and are amazing at long cons and will trick you. You can absolutely draw them to you, but they can seek you out as well. I could really go into detail, but it's probably best that I don't do it. You have to rewire your thinking completely in order to understand what's actually happening. I am going to give advice to anyone if this stuff is happening to them and they want it to stop. If you saw something, you didn't. Don't look into the woods here at dusk or at night, because if you're looking for them, you will find them. I will definitely start by praying. Pray over your family, your land, and also try it when things start to get scary to see if it stops. Sometimes it can be simple as that. Many times, despite whatever it is, it seems to work. It might stick around in the woods, but hopefully you can keep it off your property. Kids can see things that we can't. For some reason, we lose this ability as we get older. I would sit the whole family down and have a serious conversation about what's going on, just to be straight up about the woods being dangerous and whatnot, and make sure to tell everybody to not listen to anyone who's calling them into the woods, that it will never be you or anybody else. Tell your kids to let you know as soon as they see something, so you can protect them, then cast it out with prayer. My neighbors actually came to help me because things were getting so out of control for everyone. So this is why I don't post anymore or talk about these things again. Slowly, all of my neighbors have seen things. Apparently, there's rules to living in Tennessee that most locals know about but don't share. Rules like don't whistle at night if you hear your name being called from the woods. No, you didn't. You didn't hear anything. If you hear some crying or anything while the woods are still, you didn't. You never talk about it. Otherwise, your acknowledgement may bring it closer. This will be my last update. Stay safe out there. My family has a hunting cabin in the National Forest of Pennsylvania. My grandpa, who worked in a steel mill in Pittsburgh, bought the land in the 70s whenever the agents used to go into the mills and post ads for huge plots of land that the steel workers would break up and all get their own plots for dirt cheap, then help each other build their own camps. Allegedly, there was a gravesite found on the property that my grandpa bought. The details aren't exactly known how this was discovered, but apparently some type of survey was done before the property was sold. An archaeologist from the University of Pittsburgh uncovered a very old Native American grave. They excavated the grave, but the pit, by that point now just a depression in the ground, was still there. This was on my grandpa's property about 200 yards from the cabin. Of course, I don't know if any of this is true, but the depression was, and as far as I know, it's still there. And that was the story that we were all told. Of course, when I was a kid, my cousins and I used to do very dumb and stupid things, like go back to the site in the middle of the night, and we would dare each other to lay down on it. I must have been around 10 when this happened, back in the early 90s. My dad swears he doesn't remember it, but my cousin remembers it, as we still keep in touch. So we were sitting around the campfire, roasting hot dogs and marshmallows and talking, that type of stuff. Obviously there was no alcohol on my part, as I was around 10, and my dad didn't drink. I remember my dad telling everybody to be quiet, and my older cousins and my dad were talking about seeing somebody in the woods. My dad then shines a flashlight into the woods. We don't see anybody. We go back to business, and one of my cousins actually shouts, "There he is again." By shielding the light from the fire, you can see a wispy, grayish human figure walking through the woods slowly, like he's not trying to make any noise. He was walking from our left, as if he came from behind the cabin and was crossing the wood line along our left, and then across the front of the yard just along the trees, about 50 yards or so from us, taking a wide turn to avoid us. Nobody said a word. My dad and one of my cousins both shined flashlights several times, but he would disappear. You could only see him in the dark, and after your eyes were adjusted. At some point he walked in the field of view, where the fire was between us and him, and that was it. We never saw him again. One of the creepiest things out of all this is that he was walking towards the gravesite. We had never seen this before, and we never saw it again. I spent about a week every summer at the camp, until I was about 20. Family drama, weirdness. After my grandpa died, it kind of ruined the camp for us, and I haven't been back since then. Needless to say, we didn't mess with that grave, or any grave, again. After reading a few discussions on here, I decided to add one of the creepier, still unexplained events that happened to me, and to a group of friends within the past 5 years. Thinking back on it, I still get this unnerved bad feeling that just sort of lingers. Anyways, here it goes. A group of friends and myself rented a place on the lake for just a fun-filled drunken weekend. We were all in our young to mid-20s, and it was supposed to be just a big party. For the most part, that's what it was. The Friday night and Saturday morning we pretty much went all out having a blast on the water and just doing fun, stupid stuff. Well, naturally, when Saturday afternoon rolled around, we were all so dead from going all out that we decided it would be a night of no drinking, maybe a little weed smoking by some of us, and just kind of having a chill evening at night. That's what it was, relaxful. So 9 p.m. comes rolling around, and about 8 of us were inside the house, and 5 of us were outside. The house was a 2-story with a 2nd-story deck back porch, and it was surrounded by the woods, and then down through the woods you would hit the lake. I'll mention that we had already experienced some weird things from the locals when we arrived in town, mostly just backcountry old-timers that I assume were irritated because we were a bunch of college-age kids looking to have a good time. But the town and the lake are big, so it's not like anyone knew where we were staying at. Anyways, 3 of my friends were on the upstairs back porch, and my other friend and I were downstairs outside just talking on this little old table near the woods. I mean, it was otherwise just a really nice night. My friend and I were just getting lost in the conversation, and all of a sudden, there was this weird feeling, like an unnerving experience that came from the woods behind us. It was so strong that we both kind of quieted down, and then, out of nowhere, there was this loud chanting coming from deep within the woods. I have no idea how far away it was because of the way the lake is set up. I'm pretty sure the voices were carried up through the forest. It was so strong we both kind of quieted down, and then, out of nowhere, there were these loud voices coming from the woods. It sounded like some kind of secret cult, just chanting away, and all of the voices were male. I mean, they were loud and perfectly in sync. I think we were frozen for all about 20 seconds before I couldn't contain myself and ran towards the house with my friend following me. I don't know how to explain the feeling that came with that chanting, but it felt very evil, like something so uninviting. I was shaking by the time we got up to the second story and ran out on the balcony with the other 3 friends, one of them who was my brother. By the time we got up there, the chanting was gone, and I naturally asked, "Did you guys hear that?" They had also heard the voices, and now seconds later, it began again. So the 5 of us are out there peering into the forest, listening to this chanting that would sometimes sound far away, and then sound very close. They were all male voices in the weirdest language, and I don't even know what it was. It sounded almost like a strange extreme church. Then following the chanting, a loud bang like someone hit a huge metal object sounded, and then the worst part came. A man, screaming, in extreme pain, crying and screaming. All of my hair was up at this point. It was the scariest thing ever. My brother and I were staring at each other. The screaming stopped, and then it was back to the chanting, which eventually died out. I was so freaked out by it that I wanted to call the police, because it sounded like whoever screamed was in a lot of pain. That mixed with the weird chanting just made me immediately think of some terrible sacrifice going on. One friend tried to say that it must have been some drunk guys just messing around singing and being weird, but there is no way that was coming from some drunk guys. They were perfectly in sync, and then the loud screaming of pain. I didn't call the cops, and I wish I would have, but to be honest, the forest is so big, and since the lake house was up looking down at the woods and lake, it could have been anywhere. It definitely wasn't close to us, but it was close enough to hear all of that perfectly. We went in and got some of the others, but by the time they came out, everything had stopped. Someone actually wanted to go explore and find where it had been coming from, but obviously, that was a stupid idea. After that, I was so ready to go home. I can't explain the relief of driving away from there the next morning. Even now, I just get the worst feeling that whatever it was, it felt so wrong and evil. I'll never forget that moment. I can only imagine it was some sort of secret cult that possibly sacrifices humans. I lived alone in this house for the past year, and up until now, I haven't had any issues. I had first moved into the small town in the middle of the Midwest a year ago after my job had to relocate me. I'm a factory manager, and I oversee the daily operations of a newly built factory on the outskirts of town. The moving part sucked, but once I was finally moved in, I would take a moment to view my surroundings, and I was fascinated. I was never much of a nature guy. I spent most of my youth in a major city, but seeing all the towering trees that wrapped around the entire town, like a protection barrier that made me feel safe. The intimidating mountains that formed the backdrop of our town were also very impressive. They gave the horizon character. It was truly a sight to behold. After around 10 months of living here, My company was opening up a new plant, and they asked if I could go oversee operations once again. However, this time, I declined. I asked if I could stay as the permanent manager of this location. They did mention a slight pay difference, but I didn't mind. Over the past year, everything was perfect. I would wake up at around 6 a.m., do my daily morning ritual, stop by the local cafe, which gave the best coffee on the planet, and be at work by 8. My job at the factory was quite simple. I was basically a babysitter. I dealt with discrepancies, did paperwork, checked in with my supervisors, and finally headed home around 6 p.m. My job probably sounds very tedious and boring to a lot of you, but I still enjoyed it. Plus, even with a pay cut, I was still making a pretty decent salary. I'm sure most of you aren't here to listen to me talk about my job or this town. However, at the beginning of last month, I saw something out in my backyard. The way my house is set up, my backyard butts right up to the surrounding tree line that surrounds this town. I had just gotten home from my job and was lying in bed, watching TV until around 10 p.m. When I finally got ready to go to sleep, I turned off the TV and also my nightstand lamp. I had rolled over and was facing my bedroom window, which pointed directly out into my backyard. It had snowed a few days prior, so my entire backyard had a thin layer of untouched snow. I was staring out the window, letting my mind wander as I was beginning to drift off to a peaceful slumber, when I saw the flash of something near the tree line. Seeing whatever it was made my mind refocus itself as I started to scan the trees outside. Not even 5 minutes later, I saw them. 2 eyes were shining in the tree line, reflecting light from some unknown source. They would bob up and down for a moment before stopping and staring at my house. They would then turn to the right or left, disappear for a minute or two, then reappear at a different spot. At first, I thought it must have been a wolf, or maybe some other nocturnal creature looking for food. I put it out of my thoughts and fell asleep. For the entire week straight, those eyes had basically become a routine for me, as they started to appear every night in the same exact spot. I would lie awake and watch them intently. I thought that maybe perhaps the area in the trees was some sort of natural grazing spot, that whatever animal this was had become accustomed to eating here every night. I watched as the eyes walked left to right, disappeared, and reappeared until my tired eyes could no longer stay open. At the end of the first week, something happened. I had just finished turning off the TV and had rolled over to wait for the animal to arrive. A half hour passed, and I was just about to go to sleep when the eyes reappeared. The eyes shined brightly in between the dark trees. After a few moments, the eyes seemed to get closer to my house. They were faintly growing in the distance. Then, once it crossed into the threshold into my backyard, my motion sensor lights I had set up on the back of my house went off. My eyes shot wide open, and I felt my heart rate slowly start to increase as I saw what was standing in my backyard. It looked like a man. Well, almost a man, who was hunched over on all fours like a dog. Its skin was bluish gray, and stringy black hair clung to its scalp, like the legs of a spider. Its eyes were massive, taking up most of its face. The sudden bright light caused it to raise a hand to shield its eyes. Its fingers were disturbingly long, like bony sticks, hovering over its face. The thing fell back and scrambled into the dark trees. After watching this event unfold, there was no way I was going to go back to bed after that. I got up from my bed and looked around my backyard. A few moments later, the motion sensor lights diminished, I continued scanning the trees for any sign of this creature, but it was gone. I spent the rest of the night trying to find any information I could on what I had seen. I looked around at countless websites, putting the description of what I saw. Most of them spoke of a ghost and demons, but this didn't seem like a demon to me. It looked like a very real thing in my backyard. There's even other websites that mention various creatures that have some similar traits and features as what I saw in my backyard. The following week, I watched every window every single night in case it came back. But every single night, I was met with nothing. I was starting to think that what I saw wasn't even real, that I had fallen asleep while watching the trees, and that my own mind had crafted this vivid nightmare. At the beginning of last week, however, I realized it wasn't a nightmare. It was very real. I was heading to bed a little bit later than I normally would, and as I lay there, I began watching through my window. I wasn't watching as intently as I was from the previous week. Then, after one long blink, it appeared, and this time, I felt my heart thumping in my chest so hard that I thought it was going to stop at any moment. I could feel the air beginning to steam my eyes, as I hadn't shut them for 2 minutes straight. The reason I was so unnerved was that the creature was lowering its head from directly above the outside of my window. The roof of my house was still a fair distance from the top of my window, so that meant that this creature was somehow clinging to the outside of my house like a spider on a web. It stared into my window at me. Our eyes were locking in place like if we had some staring contest. I was wondering why my motion sensor lights hadn't gone off at all, but that thought quickly left my mind as I saw the creature reach its hand towards the glass. It began raking its sharp, jagged fingernails along the glass over and over again. The sound that was produced from digging its fingers into the glass, it's embarrassing to admit, but I was scared at this point, too scared to think and too scared to move. It pulled its hand away from the window, and with a quick swing, it shattered the glass into pieces. When it did this, I fell back out of bed and onto the floor. I wanted to get up to run out of there, screaming my head off, but I couldn't seem to take my eyes off this creature. It slithered its way through the broken window and crawled along the inside of my wall. It then stopped once it reached the corner of my bedroom and just stared at me. Its mouth began to crack open as if it hadn't opened its mouth for some time. Broken, sharp rotted teeth filled its mouth as it seemed to smile at me. A slight feeling of disgust began to form within the overwhelming fear that gripped me. In one rapid movement, the creature lunged from the wall of my bedroom over to me. It grabbed at me with its long fingers while its mouth was snapping in my face. I could truly sense that this creature was trying to kill me, or possibly even eat me. The commotion caused the lamp on my nightstand to topple over. I managed to switch it on with one hand, while my other hand held the creature at bay. The sudden light seemed to blind the creature briefly, and in that moment, I brought the lamp crashing down onto its head as hard as I could. It slumped over onto its side, and I shoved it off of me. I quickly got up, left the room, and called the police. I explained that a wild animal or something had broken into my house. They arrived shortly after, and I led them through my house into my bedroom. But when I opened my bedroom door, the creature was gone. They examined my broken window and realized that I was actually telling the truth. Even though when they asked me to describe what kind of animal it was, I stopped myself from telling them that it was a monster. I told them that I was sleeping and that it was too dark for me to see what it was. They nodded and told me to call them if it ever comes back. That was the beginning of last week, and I have since repaired my window and make sure that my motion sensor lights are working. I'm not sure what that creature actually was. Maybe some of you out there have more experience with this and can let me know. But as for me, well, I think I'm gonna actually contact the higher ups in my company, and I'm gonna ask them if that new manager position is still available. If it is, then I'll be more than happy to leave this place. I never really knew my grandma's brother well. All I can remember is that he was a real energetic man who lived on the hill where my grandparents resided, in the Navajo res, not far from the Chaco Wash. My grandma's brother used to reside a couple of miles north of my grandparents' place. His dwelling, more like a shack, sat on the outskirts of the Badlands. When we were young, we were instructed to steer clear of this place because it was considered evil. I never questioned why. I just accepted the warning and avoided the area. As time went by, my grandma's brother passed away under strange circumstances. He was found dead in his house. Even though he would occasionally visit my grandparents, his absence for a few days was unusual. My older uncle went to his house and discovered his lifeless body. What was strange was the hasty funeral arrangements that followed. Normally, in Navajo tradition, funerals are held on the fourth day after the person's passing, but in this case, the funeral was conducted immediately, without even informing the family. Curiosity led me to sneak over to his house to see what it looked like inside before it was torn down, as per my grandmother's request. The inside of the house felt eerie. It was a one-room, shed-like structure with faded and sun-bleached wooden boards for walls. The boards didn't fit tightly, allowing sunlight to filter in, illuminating the floating dust particles. The bed was modest, adorned with a green army blanket. There weren't that many decorations, mostly old shearing tools and knives, with no photographs in sight. An old wood stove and a small table occupied the space, alongside two crates at the far end of the room. One wooden crate laid open, revealing its contents, while the other, made of metal, was locked. After my brief exploration, I left the house, noting its vantage point, overlooking the Badlands to the west. Several years passed, and my older uncle decided to build his dream house on the exact site where my grandmother's brother had lived. Despite my grandmother's concerns about the location, my uncle was determined to proceed with the construction. He envisioned a single-story ranch-style house, equipped with all modern stuff, which was actually very rare on the res. The construction began, and everything seemed to progress easy at first. However, strange occurrences soon began to fall on the workers. Tools would go missing, and they said that there would be shadows moving within the house, and blood was discovered smeared on the walls. Even stranger were the tracks found in the sand around the house, leading from the west towards the Badlands. My uncle, an experienced hunter, couldn't identify these tracks, so he looked for help with my grandpa, who also found them perplexing. Eventually, my grandma intervened, recognizing the signs of a skinwalker. She instructed my uncle on the necessary precautions, and work on the house stopped until this issue could be resolved. Despite being careful, strange events continued to happen in the house, but my uncle pressed on. He eventually completed the house, and even yet, the disturbances persisted, driving his family to discomfort and fear. Even my grandmother's attempts to calm the spirits seemed futile against whatever forces were at play. On one specific evening, my cousins and I stayed over, and we experienced firsthand the strange nature of this house.
The generator was shut off, and then strange noises echoed through the darkness, and it almost felt like some presence seemed to stalk us from the shadows. Only the intervention of my grandparents, armed with traditional remedies and fierce determination, brought us relief from all of this. Another incident involved my younger cousin. She was alone in the truck outside, and she said as she looked to the west side of the house, she saw a pale, humanoid figure peering down at her with dark, soulless eyes. Her screaming alerted the family to come outside, but this creature had vanished before they could confront it. Even with my grandmother, a woman of great strength, she had vowed to confront whatever was there and expel it from the house. My grandma was very traditional and practiced native medicine. She also used sacred crystals to find and heal people. While looking into her crystals, she would also practice reading people's hands. There's been a few instances where she has been used to locate missing people and also found the circumstances of the way the person died. She also had knowledge of the evil way, the dark practice of witchcraft. In native medicine, my grandma had acquired a few secret items and would seek help from another medicine man. They both went into the house and began a ceremony to expel whatever was in it. They went into each room, blessing them with sage and sealing them with ash. When they finally went into the master bedroom, the medicine man started to vomit and bleed from the nose. My grandma said that she had a nauseous feeling and felt dizzy, almost fainting. They both retreated from the room and closed the door, sealing it with ash. The medicine man said the room was the source of evil, attracting evil spirits, including skinwalkers. He said he would try to pinpoint where the evil was coming from, but would need to go in alone. He began by lighting up a medicine bundle, taking bitter root, and marking his forehead with ash before entering the room. He described the room as very cold, feeling the presence of numerous spirits in the closet. Upon opening the closet, he saw a black mist on the floor, swirling like the eye of a black hurricane. He began the ceremony to close the portal, but was met with resistance. The medicine man heard a voice from the swirling mass, telling him that only the one who summoned the evil could close the portal. However, he continued the ceremony, and the mass started to diminish and eventually disappeared. Blessing the room with sage and corn pollen, he attached the burnt log to the top of the interior of the closet and sealed the door with ash. He warned my grandma that whatever was summoned was evil and too strong to keep under control, and so his recommendation was that my uncle abandon the house. Despite the warnings, my aunt, her boyfriend, and their 3-year-old son moved into the house, believing it to be a perfectly good place to save money on rent payments. However, they soon encountered paranormal experiences. One evening, my aunt heard footsteps walking down the hallway, followed by something crawling into bed with her and her son. Whatever it was, quickly got out of bed, threw off the covers, and stepped on her boyfriend's neck, causing him to choke for air. They then decided to leave the house immediately, leaving their belongings behind. Later, my younger uncle Max and his friend Leo decided to spend the night at the house to investigate. While they were there, they experienced a terrifying encounter with different spirits, including that of a little girl and a faceless figure, making them flee the house in fear. Even after these encounters, the house has remained vacant, with strange occurrences continuing to happen, such as lights turning on despite the lack of electricity. Despite the warnings and strange events, the house stands abandoned, with its curtains drawing open, as if someone is still inside, watching.
I live in the downtown area of a major Texas city. To get away from the city and enjoy the outdoors and some alone time, I would make the hour-and-a-half drive almost every weekend to a small cabin that's in the woods owned by my family. I've been hanging out at that cabin in those woods almost my entire life, so I feel pretty comfortable there. The area doesn't have many people living there, and it's always safe. So one weekend, I took some of my friends out there to fish and spend some time away from the city. While fishing on the bank of the river that runs near my folks' cabin, we pulled up some chairs, started a fire, drank a few beers, and watched the sun go down behind the trees. That is life. After sitting around for a few hours, I suggested we go hunting the next morning for breakfast. The guys weren't big fans of waking up early to crawl around in the woods looking for something to eat. They would have rather stayed up all night drinking and fishing and wake up late the next day. "Let's just go hunting right now," said one of them. Everyone else agreed and started getting loud. I stayed put in my chair and replied, "Hell no, it's too late. It's too dark. We wouldn't be able to see a thing out there, man. Plus, there's those dang witches." Everyone knew I made a good point, but then one of them said, "Wait, what do you mean by witches? What are witches anyway? Like, seriously?" I laughed a bit because they all seemed so intrigued, and all of a sudden so focused. So I began telling the story of the last time I went camping and hunting in the woods around my parents' cabin. It was just like any other camping hunting trip I had gone out on. I packed a backpack with all the necessities, a .22 long rifle, an M&P, and a .45 that I would always carry. I parked my truck at my parents' place and walked down the dirt road until it disappeared into the woods. I make a point not to overhunt in any one area, so I hiked in a direction I knew I had never hunted in. After a few hours of hiking, I found a clearing in the woods that allowed some moonlight once it got dark. I don't use a tent when I camp alone, so setting up my camp was fairly easy. I got a fire going and quickly went to go find some small game for dinner before it got too dark. After bagging a few squirrels and a rabbit, I started to head back to my campsite. The night had already started to settle in, so it was getting quite dark on me. I took a moment to light up my lantern that was hanging off my backpack. I poured some lantern oil on it and got it going. A few hundred yards later, I heard a movement in the distance. Obviously, while moving through the woods with a backpack with a rifle strapped to it, you make a lot of noise yourself. However, the noises that came from deeper in the trees have a distinct sound, almost like an echo. So when I heard movement coming from somewhere else other than myself, I froze, staying completely still and listening. There was nothing. My brain started reasoning as fast as it could, and concluded that a branch might have fallen, or a deer might have gotten spooked and hightailed it out of the area. That was good enough for me, so I continued on through the dark in the direction I knew my campsite was in. The compasses don't lie, and I had learned how to use them and rely on them by this point in my life. I heard it, again. Noises coming from my right, north of where I was. And this time, I almost thought I heard a yell of some kind. Again, I froze, thinking it was coyotes. I'm not too worried about them, so I continued. The way back was starting to feel really long though, but hiking through the woods during the day is very different than hiking through the woods at night. Most of the time you hike slower, watching your steps more carefully, so it's not unusual that a hike the same distance could take longer at night than during the day. Before I go on, I feel like I should say that I was recently married at the time. Most likely less than a year at that point. Like I wrote before, I travel a lot throughout my life, and homesickness was not something I was familiar with until I met my wife. I'll call her Juliet. We met when we were both 18, and up until then, I had never missed my home or anyone whenever I was away. But once we started dating, I began to finally experience the feeling of being homesick.
whenever I was away for too long, and in some cases, not even long at all. That Friday evening, towards the woods I had left, I got home from work and sat down with Juliet for dinner before leaving. It had only been a few hours since I last saw Juliet, and yet I missed her so badly out here in these woods. So much so that I think I almost felt pain. Having said that, I think it's gonna make what happened next a little more creepy. Anyways, so I heard something. I froze and stood still in the dark woods and turned to my right. I was deeply confused because I knew what I just heard. It was Juliet calling me. Even though it sounded like she was a bit far, there was no doubt it was her. What the fuck is she doing out here? There's gotta be some sort of emergency. I gotta find her. She's most likely been calling my phone, and it's not even on. Something bad must have happened, I thought, as my mind raced to rationalize and come up with a realistic conclusion. Chip, Chip, she yelled through the trees in the distance. My name isn't Chip, but it's the secret nickname that she has for me. I basically jogged through the dark forest towards where I last heard her calling me, stopping every now and then to listen for her again. Eventually I had to stop because I had not heard Juliet call out to me for a while. I stood there quietly, panicking for what must have been like 5 minutes, but every second was torturous. I felt like I failed to find my wife, to help her. She came all the way out here to find me because she needed me, and I couldn't even find my fucking way to her. And then, that's when I heard it again. Chip, Chip. Her voice quietly resonated through the tall trees, and she sounded like she was in pain. I began to walk as quietly as I could towards her, so I could hear her if she called out to me again. And she did. She sounded very much closer, and I was relieved as I felt myself getting closer and closer to her. Chip, Chip. This time, I was alarmed. I felt like I was about to be in danger, but I shook it off and continued towards my wife. Chip. Again, I kept listening to her calling me, but she didn't sound quite right. It almost sounded like it wasn't her at all. Just like two different people can say the same things in the same pitch and tone, but they can never sound exactly like each other. It was like there was someone else pretending to be my wife, and it was mimicking her voice, but I could hear her so clearly just a few moments ago. I figured she was choking up, trying not to cry, so I kept moving, again and again. I heard my wife calling out to me as I kept getting closer and closer. Each time she called though, her voice sounded less and less like her. By the time she sounded like she was only 10 or so yards away, I was on high alert. It sounded nothing like her by then. Whoever it was calling me wanted me to believe she was my wife, and by then, I knew for sure it wasn't her. I approached carefully with my handgun drawn. This person wasn't moving one bit, but I could tell where she was. I started getting closer, inch by inch, holding my lantern up in front of me, trying to see who I was dealing with. Then, peeking from around a tree, I saw two eyes reflecting the flame from my lamp. I have to admit, at that moment, I was fucking terrified. My wife is shorter than I am, and I was eye to eye with whoever this was, and her eyes were too far apart to have been Juliet's eyes. Hey, is everything alright? I asked her, like an idiot. I can give you anything you want. I knew right away what she really was. I knew her malicious intentions. Jesus, help me, I said under my breath in a fearful whisper. With my gun still in my hand, I safely aimed towards the ground with my finger off the trigger. As soon as those words left my mouth, She visibly flinched as if she had smelled something disgusting. I could tell by her silhouette and the reflections in her eyes though. I stood still, realizing what I had just said, while she backed away from me back into the darkness. Up until this point during my story, my buddy sat staring at me, completely silent, listening to me speak. "Dude, why the fuck didn't you just shoot her? You had a gun, didn't you?" said the youngest guy. I told him it would have been useless to shoot the witch out there. It wouldn't have killed her, or done any harm to her. "How? Why?" he replied. I began to explain to them what witches really are. People who practice witchcraft and offer rituals to demons they conjure in return for something they want. My theory was that this witch achieved her position through the sacrifice of people and animals. I could tell they were thinking it over and trying to decide whether to believe me or not. And to those listening, I know y'all might think this is crazy and not believable, and if I hadn't seen it at all before, I myself wouldn't even believe it. But the truth is, my parents were and still are very prominent figures in the church I grew up in. Being elders of the church community, they often perform exorcisms when I was a kid. And no, I don't mean the stereotypical Hollywood Catholic priest with a little white thing on his neck under a black jacket, holding up a wooden cross. They belong to a Hispanic Protestant denomination that in fact disagreed with and opposed Catholicism. Being too young to stay home alone, I was often taken with my parents on house calls to pull demons out of people. It was a horrible experience every single time. In Latino America culture, it's not uncommon for people and their kids to visit witch doctors, or even doctors who heal when somebody is feeling sick, or when they want their lives to move in a better direction, and sometimes when they want harm to come upon someone who has wronged them. However, being part of these rituals is like an open invitation for demons and leaves people open to demonic activity. So there was always someone in need of help in our community. I watched and listened to everything my parents did during exorcisms, and I had read every book my dad kept in his office about the subject. By the time I had this incident in the woods, I already knew what to do and what not to do very well. I continued my story after explaining a bit more to my buddies. As I was saying, I stood in the dark forest with my lamp held up, with my arms stretched out until I could no longer see or hear the witch backing away. My adrenaline took a while to finally settle down. Then, that's when the fear came. I tried walking back to my campsite quietly, but my nerves got the best of me, and I ended up almost running through the darkness. I was pretty confident I could find my way back, but either way, I kept checking my compass. After running and running in the correct direction, I never reached my campsite. I felt confused and doubted myself like never before. Maybe I really don't know anything about being out in the woods. How could I have gotten myself so lost? I turned around and walked until I saw a familiar pattern in the trees. Once I felt confident about where I was, I forced myself to walk back to where I ran into that witch. When I found the tree she was initially hiding behind, I stared at it for a good while, expecting her to peek around it again, but nothing. Thankfully, I retraced my steps back to where I had gone off the path to follow Juliet's voice. After hiking a bit longer, I found my campsite. I was exhausted, covered in sweat, scratched up, and hungry. I considered packing everything up and starting on the long walk back to the cabin, but I had no energy, so I called it a night. I didn't even sleep much even though I felt entirely drained. The woods were very loud at night, even by a summer night standard. The bugs and animals didn't stop to take a breath for a second, and the owls were very aggressive as well. I could hear them screaming near and far all night. Every time I began to drift off to rest, I would get awakened to the screams of the owls, echoing in the forest. or at least that's what I assumed to be. I turned to look at the guys and asked them if they were still down to creep into the woods. They looked at each other and said, "Yes." "Well, y'all go ahead. I'm not going in there right now," I said, laughing to myself. "But it didn't even do anything to you. You scared her away," one of them replied. "Maybe. But it's only because I said the name of Jesus," I said. "Well, just say it again if she comes back, dude," he said, almost annoyed. "It's not that simple. I think you really have to believe for that to work. And I can say I really did believe back then. But now, I won't be calling on anyone to come help me." After I said that, I don't remember much about the night. Other than that, all of us ended the night by watching Blood Diamond in the cabin. It's the only movie that my parents have in there. I think it was already there when they bought the place. As for what I said about believing, I'm not 100% sure it's right. Most demons hate God and Jesus, and I'm not sure if they care if you believe in God or not. It's not that I don't believe in God anymore. However, the only reason I do believe is because I seen the other side of things. That witch that I saw knew what I loved and what I missed, and that I would have done anything for my wife. I have seen, encountered, and even felt evil, but I have never felt God.
This is my true Skinwalker story. At the time of this experience, I had no knowledge, nor had I ever heard about a Skinwalker. I was 19 years old, and I lived in Phoenix, Arizona, with my parents while attending community college. My sister-in-law had asked me to go with her to Tuba City, Arizona, to visit with her mother and pick up some papers. Her mother was a school teacher there on the Navajo res. We would be staying there overnight. Her mother lived in one of those small government houses on the res. There were about 3 or 4 houses near her on a small paved street. Except for a few buildings near there, it was pretty isolated. My niece and nephew were with us, and we'll call my sister-in-law Mary, my nephew Mike, and my niece Amy. Mike was only 10 years old, and Amy was 9. It was early evening when we arrived in Tuba City. We had stopped at a fast food restaurant on the way to pick up dinner to go. After arriving at the house, we all laid together at a small kitchen table. We talked and visited a while before going into the small living room to watch TV. There wasn't a lot to do there, so Mary and I decided we would take a night drive and explore around the res. I know what you're thinking. It's a very bad idea, or a stupid idea. We drove around for about an hour and a half. Surprisingly, nothing weird happened. We were just laughing, talking, and listening to music as we drove up and down the dirt roads. After a while, we decided to head back. When arriving back home, we stayed up a little bit later, and then we decided it was time to go to bed. I slept in a small back bedroom on a twin bed next to a window with blinds. My nephew Mike slept on the floor in a sleeping bag in the same room. Mary and Amy were in the other room down the hallway. During the night, I was awakened by some strange, scratchy noises outside the window by my bed. It sounded like something was making long, slow clawing sounds down the window, like when someone runs their nails down a chalkboard. I am a light sleeper, so this of course woke me up. I whispered out loud to my nephew Mike to wake up, asking him if he was hearing the same thing I was. Mike was sleepy and groggy, being awakened from a deep slumber, so he seemed confused at first. I asked him again if he had heard the scratching noise, but he didn't answer. He was just out of it. He then laid back down and was out like a light. I was perplexed and a little scared. I thought to myself maybe it was just a stray cat or dog, but I couldn't figure it out.
I did, however, have no indication to look out that window, so I just lay there listening. After a few minutes, the clawing stopped. I must have fallen asleep because the next thing I knew, it was morning. I mentioned this at the kitchen table during breakfast, but no one seemed very interested. We left later that afternoon, and I never even thought about it again. 6 months later, I was attending one of my college courses. The teacher was lecturing us about different legends and stories of the Navajo people. He touched on the stories of evil medicine men, or witches, that are called Skinwalkers. He began telling us that they are very dangerous and harmful. They have the ability to turn into or disguise themselves as any animal. They could take the form of a coyote, wolf, or even a bear. They also been known to follow people home at night. That's why you should never be out on the res after dark. You're never supposed to make eye contact with the Skinwalker, because they can actually possess your soul. You should never talk about them, because you can draw them to you. They can cause issues and bring evil into your life. An icy chill went down my spine. I remember that night I had spent on the res. I wonder if a Skinwalker had followed Mary and me home that night after our drive. The realization that a Skinwalker had targeted us fills me with fear. I think of this often, and I'm so glad I didn't look out the window that night. I'm also haunted by the fact that there was just a very thin pane of glass separating me from such an evil thing. And now, I guess I know why no one in the family wanted to talk about it. When I was a kid, my favorite time of the year had to be winter. There was just something about all the festivities that gave me a sense of wonder. It might sound a little cliche, or possibly a little cringy, but to me as a kid, the holidays felt magical. I would spend my winters watching my family put up all sorts of decorations around the house. Lights, ribbons, and I can't forget about the star attraction, the Christmas tree. My father and I had this tradition. Every year, we would venture out to our local tree farm, and he would let me run around and select our very own Christmas tree. It was one of the few times that my father and I had a chance to bond. He would tell me all these stories about his past, and how his own father would take him. Even though my father wasn't one to show emotion, I could tell that these trips to the Christmas tree forest actually meant the world to him. As the years progressed, my love for Christmas kinda diminished. I suppose that's something that just happens over the years. People get old, develop a new interest and responsibilities. During high school, I honestly couldn't care less about Christmas. To me, it was starting to just become another day, another pointless get-together with people whom I barely even know or remember. Maybe it was those rebel teenage years, but I just couldn't see the point anymore. That must have been the reason my parents stopped putting so much effort as they used to. Eventually, my father stopped offering to go Christmas tree shopping with me, and the holiday just sort of fell by the wayside. During my senior year in high school is when I met Sarah. She was incredible, and we instantly clicked. A few months after meeting, we began dating. Early into our relationship, I realized fairly quickly that her family took Christmas very serious. Every year I was amazed by all the decorations and how much they loved Christmas. It was honestly like something out of a Christmas movie. As time went by, Sarah and I moved in together. We had lived in different apartments over the years, until finally we had saved up enough money to buy a house in the suburbs. As the year started drawing to a close, and the winter holidays were fast approaching, I wanted to try and rekindle my old love for Christmas. Once December came around, we went out, and I bought a ton of decorations. We filled up the house from wall to wall with many different items. Decorations in every size hung in all the windows, and also on the doors. The lights had been strung up around the exterior of the house. It was most likely a bit too much, but I still had fun putting all the decorations up. Sarah and I had talked about what we were going to do about the Christmas tree. She offered to go buy a synthetic one at a store somewhere, but I told her I had a better idea. I explained to her about a weekend that my father used to take me tree shopping, and I told her how it used to be my favorite part of Christmas. Without missing a beat, she asked me when I wanted to go. We made plans to go shopping for one at the end of the week, and I'll be honest, that made me feel happiness I hadn't felt in years. Friday had arrived, and after getting home from work, Sarah asked me if I still wanted to go. I nodded, and with a smile, she grabbed her coat. We headed back out into the winter air and hopped into my truck. We drove 4 hours trying to find a decent tree farm. A few of them had already sold out, which was quite shocking to me. And other tree farms, well, their selection didn't look too great. After driving for nearly 45 minutes, we found a place. As we pulled into the lodge, the tires of my truck struggled to get any traction in the snow. Our shoes were crunching into the fallen snow, and we walked up to the gate. The trees that stood before us seemed to stretch in every direction. Sitting off to the side was an older man, who seemed to be reading a book by a portable heater. Sarah and I walked over to him, and he struggled to peel his eyes away from his book. In an effort to be funny, I asked him if he had any treats for sale, but the look that he gave me over the edge of his book didn't seem to be amused. With a heavy sigh, he rested his book into his lap and pointed out to the trees. Then he said, "Find one you like, and come let me know, and then I'll get it for you." I said thank you and entered through the gate, with Sarah following closely behind me. As we entered the forest, we both stared in wonder at all the options. Sarah quickly called me over and asked if this tree would be good. The tree was kind of tall to fit into our house. It was a great tree, but it was too big for the living room. We continued walking, looking around for that perfect tree. After a while, I realized I could no longer see the light from the entrance. The shift in the air was chill, and the warm glow of the light bulbs had been replaced by the cold moonlight overhead. Sarah rubbed her arms in an effort to stay warm, and I was beginning to realize that we needed to decide on a tree pretty quickly before one of us freezes out here. Then, we saw it. The perfect tree, only a few yards ahead of us. I grinned as we got closer, but as I was getting closer and closer, I heard Sarah whisper for me to stop. My feet stopped in place, and I turned back to look at her to see what was wrong. Sarah was staring off into the distance, her face more pale than I had ever seen before. I asked her what was wrong, but she didn't answer. She just kept staring. I followed her gaze and saw what she was looking at. Between a few trees off in the distance, 2 eyes were looking right back at us. The shadows cast by the trees around it were obscuring its body, but its eyes seemed to pierce through the darkness. I looked back to Sarah and she managed to whisper, saying that we should leave. I turned back to look at the eyes in the darkness. They were still there, still wide, and still staring directly at us. Then, the eyes began to move out from the trees. As they did, they started to rise higher and higher above the ground. After a few seconds, the eyes were nearly half as tall as the tree it stood next to. It stepped out into the moonlight, and I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Its body was unlike anything I had ever seen before. It looked like some kind of beast. Dark fur covered it from its head to its toes. Massive clawed hands gripped the tree next to it, and I could see the tree strain from the pressure. Large horns were protruding out from its head, curling up and back from its body.
It exhaled a deep breath through its nostrils. The gust of warm air visibly obscured its face for a moment. It took another step closer. The twigs beneath its feet were crunching loud as it approached. I could see its face a little bit better now. A dark liquid dripped from its lower jaw, staining the pure white snow beneath it. Sarah took a step back, and I could hear a twig snap below her foot. I turned my attention to her, and she was nearly crying at this point. The twig snapping was like a trigger. The creature started to roar, and this drew my attention back. That's when it started to run at us. But it wasn't running like a fucking animal. It was running like a person. And looking at this, my eyes went wide with panic, and I turned to Sarah, yelling at her to run. We both began sprinting through the snow, dodging the numerous trees as they passed us by. Even though we were both running as hard as we could, I could still hear that thing's footfalls growing closer and closer to us. Then, the sound of splintering wood echoed from behind us. I turned just in time to see a massive tree falling towards us with immense speed. I called out to Sarah to look out, and she moved away from it, when I did the same thing as well. The tree impacted the ground, and it shook the earth beneath my feet. I called for Sarah, asking if she was alright, and for a moment, there was no answer. I called again, and that's when a response came. I ran around the fallen tree, and I found her sitting near another tree. I held out my hand and helped her up. That's when we heard another loud shriek, coming from deep in the woods. We looked to one another before running out of the forest back into the light of the entrance. The old man looked up from his book and asked us if we found one we liked, but we paid him little mind as we ran out of the fence, hopped into my truck, and drove away. There's quite a bit of few different things in this world that I can't explain, and that night is at the very top of this list. I have no idea what that thing was. Maybe some of you out here have an idea, but I'm at a complete loss. I still love the holidays and Christmas, but this year, I think I'm just gonna buy an artificial Christmas tree, and I would advise all of you to do the same. Stay away from the forest, and be careful when you go in there, if you go in there to look for a Christmas tree. Behind my house lies a forest, and within that forest, there's a trail that stretches from one end to the other. I discovered this trail not long after I had moved into my house. I was lounging out in the back one day, while my dog Rex was running around the backyard. After a few moments, I realized that I could no longer hear the skittering sounds of Rex running. I sat up and looked around. Sure enough, he was gone. I called out Rex's name, and within a couple of seconds, I heard distant barking originating from within the woods. Fearing that he may have gotten injured, I quickly jumped up from my chair and ran towards the trees. When I got close to the tree line, I noticed a break in the foliage. It was hard to see from a distance, but up close, it was unmistakable. The gap in the woods led to a much larger path, which seemed to go from east to west. I ventured onto the trail, whistling and calling for Rex. Thankfully, I found him a couple of minutes later. He was a little off the trail, having a standoff with a very cocky raccoon. I couldn't help but laugh as I realized that the raccoon was actually winning. I called Rex over to my side, and he accepted defeat. At this point, I was able to stop and admire the scenery around me. I began walking along the path with Rex by my side. The colorful leaves against the sunlight gave the entire forest a golden appearance. The sound of leaves rustling overhead as a gust of wind passed by and filled my ears. I saw Rex playfully run from one side of the path to the other, sniffing and exploring. We walked for 20 minutes before I decided it was time to head back. I called Rex and he followed along as we slowly made our way towards the house. After nearly a half hour of walking, I found a break in the tree line that led to my backyard. Ever since that day, I have taken Rex on a walk through the woods at least once a week. The walk sometimes happens on my day off from work, as I only get one a week anyway. The day always starts off with Rex waking me up, shoving me over and over again. He has become accustomed to these walks and has learned the routine. I eventually stir from my sleep and start getting ready, performing my usual morning routine, getting dressed, and eating before running some errands. When I get back from my trip into town, I change into my boots and open the back door. Rex flies out of the door at 100 miles per hour, and I follow slowly behind. Thankfully, Rex is pretty well trained by this point and has learned to wait for me before going into the woods. He stands at the gap in the trees, looking back at me until I'm close enough for him to enter. Then we spend an hour or so walking that trail, and during this time, I check my phone and answer emails while Rex plays in the leaves. We walk this trail so frequently that I know most of the surrounding area by heart. About a quarter mile to the west, the trail lets out to a small city park. To the north, through the brush, is a small creek. I only know about this because Rex one time chased a squirrel through that water. Aside from that, there wasn't much else to the north. To the east is the one that I know the least about. The path seems to extend for quite some time. Rex and I walked along the east path for hours without seeing any indication of an end. Eventually, the time would come for us to head back before it started getting dark outside. Then, a week ago, something happened in those woods that Rex and I will never forget. The day started off the same as any other. Rex playfully pushed me away, and I made my way to the bathroom. After a couple of hours getting ready, I checked on my schedule and realized that I didn't have to go into town today. So I decided that since I had all this free time, I would spend it walking with Rex instead. I put on my boots and opened the back door. Rex, of course, ran out, and I followed slowly behind. We pushed our way through the brush and into the path. I turned right, and we began walking towards the east. For the first hour, Rex ran from one side of the path to the other, just sniffing the whole time. While we may have been coming out here every week, it seemed like it was always his first time. The trail began to curve further into the woods, and before I knew it, we had reached the farthest we had ever gone in this direction. I looked down at him, and he returned a look of confused excitement. As we continue onward, I noticed that the trees on either side of us had started to become more and more densely packed together. The previously bright sunlight that scattered through the treetops began to diminish, and only an orange glow remained above. My eyes were drifting from side to side, still admiring the scenery, until I looked ahead, down the path. I noticed something wrong with Rex. He was standing a few yards away from me, completely motionless. I called out to him, but he didn't even move. I walked a bit closer and saw that he was staring at something off into the woods. I stopped a few feet away and followed his gaze. I thought it might have been a bear or some large animal that caused Rex to freeze. And then, standing a couple of yards into the woods, between a few of the trees, was a person. A woman, to be exact. She was wearing a white dress, which was contrasting against her surroundings. She had dark-colored hair that hung loosely in front of her face. At this distance, it was difficult to make out what she looked like. I walked up next to Rex and called out to the woman, asking if she was alright. My voice didn't seem to get a response. I turned my attention to Rex, and I told him that we should head back home. When I reached down to him, I could feel that he was trembling in place. He suddenly began to back away from where he was. I wasn't sure why until I looked back up to where the woman was, and she was now very much closer to the path. Her head was lifted, and I could see her face through the strands of dark hair. I could see that her skin was a pale, bluish color. Her jaw, which seemed to be dislocated, was dangling towards her neck. Her deeply bloodshot eyes stared at me with an anger like I had never seen before. The sounds of bones snapping echoed from this woman as she raised an arm towards me. When she did this, I felt my body react, and in a flash I stood up, grabbed Rex by his collar and pulled him away from her. We both ran down that path once again. After a few minutes of running, Rex and I finally emerged from the trees into our backyard. I had never been so happy to see my house before in my life. I ended up collapsing shortly after entering my house, and I didn't wake up until noon the next day. I'm not sure who, or possibly what, that woman was. But ever since then, Rex refuses to go anywhere near our back door. And to be honest, I don't blame him. If any of you out there live near the woods, please be careful. There are things in those trees, things that you don't ever want to see for yourself. Last Monday, I went on a walk into the woods. I go all the time, whether it's spring or winter. I'm 18 years old, I'm not very tall, and I don't weigh much. So I'm a pretty fast runner too. Sometimes it can get really creepy out there in the woods. My mom and grandparents, they live right down the road by the way, always told me that if I start to feel unsafe out there, I always need to leave. They never said why, but I always figured they were afraid of the coy dogs, and it never seemed that important. I did listen to them though. So Monday afternoon, maybe a bit past 4 o'clock, I left to go walking. I had been out there just 2 days before with no issues, but after walking for about half a mile, the feeling that I was being watched began. I kept walking until I came to the old logging road. It makes for a quick way around the woods, and it also connects to the road that my house and my grandparents' house are on. I was getting pretty tired of hiking through the snow-covered bushes and logs. I still felt like something was watching me, and just a few moments before, I could have swore I saw something moving around from the corner of my eye. So I decided to walk down the logging road instead. As I was walking down it, I heard the sound of chains rattling nearby, and started looking around for them. I was thinking maybe it was just chains in a tree blowing in the wind, but I couldn't find any chains, and I stopped hearing it after a second. I kept walking and was getting close to my grandparents' land when I heard the chains again. I stopped walking to look around me and to check to see if maybe it was something I was wearing, my jacket, my necklace, but it wasn't anything on me. I jumped around to double check and maybe looked really stupid, but I knew it wasn't me making the noise. I decided just to go to my grandparents' house and walk back using the actual road. But as soon as I started heading into the woods, I heard something. It sounded like my own footsteps had been in time with a second pair that were maybe about 10 feet away, which made no sense because there had been nothing there just a moment ago. I took another step and heard something step at the same time from behind me. I didn't turn around. I was too afraid, so I acted as if I was going to take another step, but I stopped my foot right above the snow. I wanted to make sure I wasn't going crazy. Behind me, whatever there was, stepped down. I heard the snow crunch, then it moved forward again, quickly. It must have known I figured out it was there. That's when I started running towards my grandparents' land, and whatever was behind me followed. It sounded humanish, and the sound of the chain started up again when it started chasing me. The thing definitely had only 2 legs, and it sounded pretty big. There's a lot of thorn bushes, small trees, and other things that stay around all year, even in the winter. When I ran between them, as best as I could, it was just going right through them. I glanced behind me for a second, and all I saw was a really tall, gray, humanoid blur before I looked back in front of me. The final stretch was terrifying. I could hear heavy breathing and chains rattling just a few feet behind me the entire time, and it sounded like it was almost growling. My grandparents' dog was up in the yard near the house and started barking, but he didn't run towards me. He just stayed by the house barking. Then he ran with me to the house when I got close to him. I ran up the door and went inside. The dog came in right beside me, and I slammed the door shut. I didn't hear anything, and I looked out the window, but there wasn't anything there. The dog was leaning onto me and shaking. My grandfather came to the door from upstairs after just a few seconds, and I started crying and told him everything. He became very serious and told me, "Don't think about it. Just forget it ever happened." I tried to ask him why, but he refused to tell me anything. I tried asking my grandmother too, but she didn't say anything, and she changed the subject. When I was 13, I was on an ATV with my two older sisters, one 15 and the other 18. We were going to my grandma's place, which was less than 2 kilometers away from my parents' place. We were traveling through our fields, but on the way, I suggested we go around the fence so we didn't have to open the gates. It was pretty much the same road, just a bit off to the side. As we get to the middle of the field, we all noticed something sitting on top of the hill we were about to climb. We slowed to a crawl because it looked human. We thought maybe it was an animal that had fell and was stuck, or maybe it was my uncle who looked after the cattle. But this thing was sitting weird, basically like how Spider-Man perches over buildings, crouched down on top of a rock. I want to describe this thing. It was tall, skinny, and was wearing nothing. Just the body is what we could see, grayish color, and the head wasn't shaped like a human's head. It was thin and small. We were about 30 to 40 meters from this thing, and it was during the day too. As we were sitting there trying to figure out what we were seeing, this thing slowly stood up and my heart sank. Its arms were long, very long. I screamed to stop and instantly jumped from the front of the ATV to the driver, replacing my sister. As we were switching, this thing started running at us, but it was running weird. Its arms were swaying back and forth like normal runner, but because of how long the arms were, it looked weird. You would think it would run on the long arms, but it didn't, and it was running fast. I turned around and shot off straight through the field. My sisters were screaming that it was still coming, but to be honest, I could not look back at this thing, so I just said, "Don't look at it." We rounded the corner, and that's the last we saw of it. As we got home, I crashed the ATV into the deck, trying to get in as fast as we could. We were so scared my parents actually believed us. They called all the family to warn in case it was a trespasser. They said nobody saw anything or anyone in the fields after that. Someone, please. I don't know what to do. I try to tell my wife about this, but she's a science teacher, and thanks to my history of practical jokes, she thinks I'm just kidding. There's something stalking me. I don't know what it wants, but almost every night, since I started seeing it, it has terrorized me. It doesn't touch me. It doesn't do anything. It doesn't communicate in any sort of way. It just fills me with horror. If what I'm about to say seems like I'm just rambling, please forgive me. I haven't slept in several days. We live in the second floor of a duplex, with stairs down to the back of the house, to the basement, where the laundry machines are. There's a door at the bottom of the stairs, before the door to the basement, that looks out onto our back porch and into the backyard. 6 days ago, I was going down to the basement to bring up some laundry, and I glanced out the door as I passed, and there was a dark figure standing at the far edge of our yard. Her back was to me, and she was just standing there. She was looking into the woods beyond our yard. She was dressed in nothing but a light gown. It had lots of flowing material coming off of it that was whipping around in the air slowly. The whole scene creeped me out instantly, but I thought she might be a friend of our downstairs neighbor, so I just continued to the basement. And then when I came back up, she wasn't there. The next night I went down again, and as I passed the back door, I looked outside. The woman was back. She was exactly like she was the night before, facing away, not moving. The hair on my arms and neck stood up straight when I saw her. I was even more creeped out when I realized she was in the same clothes as the night before. That's when I did something I shouldn't have done. I opened the back door. Leaning out, I called to her to see if she was okay, but she didn't respond. She didn't even make some sort of indication that she heard me. It was freezing cold, so I shut the door and locked it. Coming back upstairs afterwards, I looked out the window and she was gone again. Later on that same night, I was in the bedroom getting ready to go to sleep. Everything was dark because my wife had gone to bed before me. Our bedroom looks out over the backyard, and my side of the bed faces the windows, so I have to go past them to get in. As I was doing so, I got that same deep dread feeling in my stomach that I had gotten the first time I saw the figure in the backyard. Something compelled me to hesitate by the windows. My hands were shaking as I pulled the curtain back a bit and looked through the shades into the backyard. It was a clear night, so the backyard wasn't shrouded in darkness. And there she was. The woman was standing in the middle of the backyard, no longer at the edge of the woods, and this time she was facing the house. Her head was tilted up, looking directly at the window I was peeking from. I jerked away instantly, afraid she had seen me. Her face was covered in shadow and hair, but I saw her chin and nose, a sharp nose and a thin chin. Gray. Her skin looks gray, I think. Her hair is black and long. I was so scared I jumped into bed and covered myself with the covers. The next day, I played outside in the snow with my 4-year-old daughter. She wanted me to pull her on her sled in the backyard, but just the thought of going back there made me scared again. So I talked to her into digging holes in the snow, but in the front yard. When the night arrived, things went from bad to worse. Somehow, I had managed to forget about the woman. Then, in the middle of the night, my daughter starts crying. Our bedroom is just across the hall from hers. I thought she might need to use the bathroom or was just having a bad dream. So I went into her room to see if she was okay. She was uncovered, curled into a ball on her mattress. I pulled her covers over her, and that's when she whispered to me, "Daddy, there's someone in my closet." Instantly, I got goosebumps. I turned my head slowly towards the closet door at the end of her bed. Normally, the closet is shut, but now, it was open. As I looked into the closet, there was a dark shadow. That's when I saw her. The woman was standing in my daughter's closet. Not even when it was clear that I saw her did she move or make a sound. She just stood there and looked at me through the cracked open door. My blood ran cold when I saw her. "Get up," I told my daughter. "Get in my arms, quickly, quickly." She scrambled up and hugged me tightly as I walked backwards out of the room, watching the closet the entire time.
In my mind, I imagined her throwing the closet door open and running at us, arms outstretched. I just hugged my daughter and walked backward into my room. The woman never appeared in the doorway. I heard no movement from my daughter's room. I tucked her into my bed and stood there watching the doorway to her bedroom. I didn't go back in. I just stood there and watched then listened. When I finally got the courage to climb into bed, I didn't sleep. Sunday came and I told my wife everything. I told her about the first time I saw this woman. I told her about calling out to her and seeing her from the window. I told her that she appeared in our daughter's closet. She told me it wasn't funny, that it was my fault for our daughter's bad dreams, and that I shouldn't encourage her to be afraid of her closet. Sunday night, my daughter called me to her room again. Call me a coward, whatever you want, but I couldn't go back into that room. I called out to her, quietly, to come get in our bed, but she cried and said she was scared. I wanted to go and get her, but I was scared too. I told her to pull her blankets up and cover herself. Just cover yourself, honey, and you'll be okay. I prayed that it was true. I lay there, looking over the sleeping form of my wife and out into the hallway at the closed door of my daughter's room and just kept praying. She kept crying a few minutes longer, but then she went quiet, and I hoped that she was asleep. Monday arrived. I put toys in front of the door to her closet. By that time, there was no doubt in my mind that this was some sort of ghost, but I still put things in front of the closet anyway, even though I knew a pile of toys couldn't stop a ghost. Monday night arrived, and my daughter didn't cry, but I didn't sleep. I lay there, looking at the ceiling, tense. Then around 2 a.m., I heard her bedroom door creak open, and I knew something was wrong. She must be scared, I thought. So I called to her like before. Just come to me and you can sleep in our bed, sweetie. But she didn't come. So I peeked over to my wife, and the woman was standing there in the doorway to my daughter's room. Her arms hung at her sides. Her shoulders were slouched down. Her gown was dirty, like it hadn't been washed in years, and it was hanging off her like torn rags. I wasn't taking a single breath. I wasn't blinking. I just looked at her, and she looked at me, and I thought, this is it. I'm gonna die. But she didn't make a movement, never even made a sound. I whisper, please, go away. Leave me alone. Sorry. I couldn't look away. If I look away, she will get closer. I was sure of it. If I close my eyes, when I open them, I know she'll be standing over me, looking at me. At some point, she was gone. It's like I fell asleep with my eyes open, even though I don't remember her disappearing. Just that I was looking at the doorway, and she wasn't there anymore. Last night, I laid awake, waiting. I asked my wife to shut our bedroom door, because the nightlight in the hallway was keeping me awake. It was stupid. I don't know what I was thinking. Like clockwork, I heard my daughter's bedroom door creak open. I held my breath. Then I heard the boards in the hallway creaking, and I started shaking uncontrollably. I heard our bedroom door open, and I knew she was standing there, in the doorway, not moving, just looking at me. But I didn't look. I couldn't. I did what I had told my daughter to do, and pulled the covers over my head. I'm a complete mess, a zombie at work. I don't even want to go home anymore. I think I'm starting to see the woman in other places, a glance while driving, and I think she's sitting in the passenger seat of the truck behind me, or standing in the street as I drive off. Just sitting here at my desk, someone passes by behind me, and I jump. I'm afraid that if I turn around, she'll be there, waiting for me to look at her. And what if I saw her face? But I don't want to see it. I don't even want to see her anymore. But I don't know what to do. The only hope I feel is that, for unrelated reasons, my wife has mentioned about moving, but our lease isn't up until May, and I don't know if I can hold out that long. About 8 years ago, my dad did woodwork and refurbished an old 1800s wardrobe, and he decided it would look good in their bedroom, which it actually did. After about 2 nights of keeping it in the bedroom, my mom started to complain that it was eerie and she had a bad feeling about it. I remember her saying that about a week later, it started opening itself in the night and she could see a person in it and that he talked to her. Of course, my dad didn't believe her and kept it in the room, and it just got worse. The house started smelling and the air became damp in my parents' room, and they didn't know where it came from, so they decided to look for mold, but they couldn't find any, so they just went on cleaning and spraying stuff to make it smell nice. About 3 months later, the activities got worse. The whole house was affected by it, and the doors in the house would unlock themselves. Shelves would open up by themselves, and the cups my mother drank from would always be broken when she woke up. This obviously scared my mom, and so she decided to sell the wardrobe. It ended up in the hands of 2 old people, who a week later sold it on eBay. We don't know where it is now, for obvious reasons. I also forgot to add, my dad, when he refurbished it, he found a panel under the wardrobe where a little red box that was dusty laid. Curiosity hit, and they opened it. Inside was an old cufflink button, a letter, and a strand of hair that my mother thought was off a horse, because she kept horses, and when one had passed, she would keep a strand of the horse's hair. Obviously, they put it back in the box and tried to find out whose it was, but they had no luck in finding who the box belonged to, so they ended up putting it back where they found it, in the wardrobe. I also want to apologize if this story isn't typed out correctly. I'm not very good at writing, but I thought the story belonged here. And yes, before you all start asking, this isn't fiction. This is something that actually happened. I experienced it. I saw a few things. I woke up at night and heard things and saw shadows. But all of these experiences were nowhere near as bad as the ones that my mother experienced. I have no pictures of the wardrobe or the items at the time. There was no reason to take a picture of them. But I'm sure I can try to find the wardrobe on eBay, on Wayback Machine, but the chances are very slim. If I have any luck, I will inform all of you. So to everybody out there, if you're out purchasing antiques or used furniture, please make sure you inspect them in detail. If you see something, don't open it, don't mess around with it, and return it before anything starts happening in your life. This is not something that happened to me, but to my husband and his mother. When he was 10 years old, we will call him Brett. His mother we will call Kim, and my brother-in-law we will call Mike. My husband moved around a lot when he was growing up. Kim was a single mother who left an alcoholic and abusive husband. Mike was an introvert, and my husband Brett was an outgoing all-American boy who always had to be doing something. They lived in 5 different homes and apartments in the same city, but the one mentioned the most is a 2-story home that was for rent on Maple Crest Drive. A week after they moved in, small things started to happen. Things would get moved, water in the sinks would start running, and the lights would flicker on and off. They had electricians come in, plumbers, etc., but they never found anything wrong. Things went on in this odd way for a while, but then more things started happening. like stomping on the stairs, appliances coming on by themselves, and shadows moving down the hall, passing their bedroom doors. Then about 6 months from the time that they moved in, the shadows started coming into the bedrooms. Brett often woke up to something moving in the corner of his room. He said one night he was sleeping with his hand over the bed, and something bit it. He also said that he would hear whispers, but they did not come in clear enough for him to understand. But the scariest things would happen to Kim. One night, she woke up feeling like she was being choked, but there was no one else in the room. She would be cleaning, and something would pull her hair. But she said that the scariest night was the night she was dragged down the hallway and down the stairs. Everyone thought that she was crazy. They didn't see the scratches, or the bruises, or the mental strain that Kim was going through. She then went to the library and got this book on the paranormal. The book instructed to put flour or baby powder on the floor. The first night nothing happened, but the second night there were prints in the flour. They looked like what a gorilla's fist looked like if you made it longer and put talons on the end. The next morning they packed their bags and moved into a women's shelter. They never figured out what it was. All they knew was that Kim and Brett were being haunted, and whatever it was leaving Mike alone.